Good to see everybody. Thank y'all for coming out on a spring break Wednesday. Did y'all know it was spring break? Yeah. We, homeschoolers, we just kind of, I say we, it's all falling on Donna. Spring break is when you just declare it, You're like, all right, we're on spring break. That's how that works. So, but thank you all for being here. Let me remind you, those of you who come on Thursdays, we sent this out in the week. I'm looking at the camera at the same time. We sent this out in the weekly email. We won't be having the prayer time at 11 tomorrow. There's a senior event, so if you're coming to that, enjoy that time. We'll meet again starting next week at 11 here in the sanctuary. So no Thursday prayer time tomorrow. All right, y'all take your Bibles, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 14. We return really to this idea of idols, meat sacrificed to idols. The next paragraph after this one, y'all, is about head coverings. And, women covering their head, men not covering. That's right. We got one biblical person in the room. And the rest of y'all, I don't know what your problem is. You're just rebellious. And but anyway, it's going to be interesting getting into that in the next week or two. But anyway, what we look at tonight is he's really been talking about idolatry and about Christian freedom, and making sure that you don't put a stumbling block before other people, before weaker brothers. And he's going to wrap that up. And in all of that, he's going to talk a little bit about the Lord's Supper and everything. And so we'll just take it a few verses at a time. Now, I remind you what we just saw in chapter 10, 1 through 13. He has gone over and over again and talked about things that happened to the nation of Israel, times when they had sinned against the Lord and had fallen short. And so he ended that paragraph with verse 13 of chapter 10, where he says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." And so that's how he ends that paragraph. And we talked about that when there is a temptation, that as believers, there's always an out. There's always an escape, whether it's getting away from that person, whether it's no longer thinking that thought, whether it's whatever it might be. There's always some way to get away from that sin. So he then the first word in verse 14 is therefore. So the idea that there is an escape, that we are going to be tempted. He then takes all the things he's talked about and makes two more applications about idolatry. So he says in verse 14, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." Now, he has just said in verse 13, there's always an escape. And so he gives us the escape for idolatry. Run. Get out of there. Don't do the thing, similar to Joseph and Potiphar's wife. This is something that is pretty easy to avoid in their context, because their context, he's going to talk about it in a minute, idolatry was, the temple down the street. You were surrounded by it. You and I don't have a lot of that around here. There are places still in Shelby County and surrounding areas where you can find idols. You go down Highway 64, there's the temple there that, they call it the Indian Cultural Center. It's right before you get into Fayette County as you're going out Highway 64. There's a place there that's got all the idols from that part of the world. So wherever you're from, you can go and find the idol that you worshiped, and you can worship it there. I've been there. It was interesting. You got that. Is that big Buddha still in the front yard? Is that still there, those of you who live in that part of town? So we have that here in town, which is lovely. The Buddha in somebody's front yard. But we don't think much about Old and New Testament idolatry. We don't see a lot of that. So we understand and we apply it to that an idol is anything that we place as being more important in God than our relationship with Him. Paul here is, and that the application can be made that way, but he's speaking here specifically of just out and out idolatry, pagan religions and pagan beliefs and pagan practices. And he says, just flee. Just get out of there. So verse 15. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. And so he says the cup of blessing, he begins to talk about the Lord's Supper. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? So here's what he's about to do. He's about to take the Lord's Supper and what happens when we have the Lord's Supper and the genuine worship that is, and then point out that these pagans are doing the same thing in their temples, but with demons. And so that's why he's going to talk about what he is with this meat that's sacrificed to idols. So he's taking the right thing, the godly, the positive thing, the Lord's Supper. And notice how he describes it. He says the cup of blessing, so he's talking about the juice, the wine, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation? Literally, is it not a fellowship in the blood of Christ? Now, we know it doesn't literally become the blood of Christ. We've dealt with all that stuff in the Reformation. It's symbolic of the blood of Christ, but there is a sense of we are remembering and being grateful for the shed blood of Jesus. It's a very worshipful moment. And then he talks about the bread that we break. Is it not a participation? Is it not a fellowship in the body of Christ? The fact that Jesus was tortured and that he was killed and that he actually died and rose again. We remember all that with the Lord's Supper. We remember the fact that he's coming back. Paul talks about, and when we get into the Lord's Supper theology of chapter 11, he's going to talk about we do this until the Lord comes. So when we have the Lord's Supper, it's also in anticipation of his second coming. And so he's reminding them of the Lord's Supper. As I said, he's going to spend in chapter 11, verses 17 through 34, talking about it because they're not doing it right. We're going to find that out in a few weeks. But so he says, here's what the Lord's Supper is. Verse 17, because there's one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Then he begins to talk about where things get tripped up. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat sacrifices participants in the altar? He's just talked about in the previous paragraph, 1 through 13, all the times, not all, but many of the times that the nation of Israel disobeyed God and fell into idolatry and fell into these pagan practices like those who are around them. So he says in verse 19, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. So he's saying, do not go there during worship time. Do not go there and participate in these things, even though you might think you have the freedom to know this isn't real, that this idol doesn't actually exist. Like people have gotten puffed up with that knowledge. He's telling them there is demonic power behind these idols. You know, Zeus doesn't exist. He's not a real thing, but Satan can certainly make you think that Zeus is real because Satan can do some supernatural stuff. Hermes doesn't exist, but certainly Satan can make you think that Hermes exists because people, you know, have prophecies. I'm not sure if I'm using the right God or not, but, you know, that sort of thing. You know, you have the oracles and all these people, and this supernatural stuff would happen. I mean, we see that when you study, you know, the Antichrist and his prophet and all that. I mean, you see that Satan has supernatural power. I'm in Job as part of my quiet time reading in the morning, and the whole thing kicks off because, you know, Satan has the power to control and bring weather, you know, as he takes out, you know, Job's family and does all kinds of things. I mean, God says, just don't kill him. You can do whatever you want, just don't kill him. And Satan brings all kinds of destruction. So he's much more powerful than you and I are. So he has that power. And behind those demons behind those idols that people have created in their own image, right? That's the opposite. Here's Christianity is we are created in God's image. All other religions are people creating God in people's images. You go back and read, any kind of Greek mythology or anything like that. Those gods are horrible. Like, they're killing one another and cheating on one another and doing this and doing that. I mean, it's interesting stories, that you've probably read and learned from. But, I mean, they're terrible because they were created by people. And people are terrible and sinful. So they just, that's the stories they came up with. And so that's what he's saying. Stay away from that stuff because there's actually some spiritual power behind it. There's demonic power. In the middle of verse 20, I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. In other words, you can't have it both ways. You cannot cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And the answer to that is, no, we should not provoke the Lord to jealousy, and no, we are not stronger than he is. And this idea of God's jealousy is, you probably see it best in Exodus 32 with the golden calf. We'll get there eventually on Sunday night. If you remember in that story, God's ready to just take them all out and just start over with Moses. He's like, that's it. Done with them, and they were just getting started, right? Moses has just been on the mountain for a while. I mean, they've barely gotten formed. They're barely out of Egypt. And so you see them, you see that God is a jealous God, not in a sinful sense, where, you and I are jealous of things. Like, frankly, I'm a little bit jealous. The youth have Papa John's in there tonight. They ordered pizza. We don't have Papa John's in here. Not happy about that. There's a little bit of jealousy going, right? That's a sinful thing, that kind of jealousy. But God's jealousy is sinless and perfect because he is the only thing, the only being, the only person, because God is a person in the sense he has personhood, that is worthy of our worship. And so he is jealous for that. When you and I do something that is contrary, when we worship something that is not him, it provokes in him a righteous and perfect and sinless jealousy, because there should be nothing that we worship other than him. Often it's self. Modern paganism there's really two forms of it, in my opinion. And this is what I think, and you can tell me whether you agree or not. I think there's two main forms that paganism has taken today, because it hadn't gone anywhere. People are still people. One is when we make an idol of ourselves. People do that. They worship themselves. Whether it's, and Instagram has made it worse. I saw a thing the other day that it said that that if a person is narcissistic, one of the ways to tell is they take a tremendous amount of selfies and post them. Narcissists love selfies. And so, if you post a selfie, that doesn't mean you're a narcissist. I've posted a few over, every now and then too. But, social media, there are people who make their entire living because of how they look. And because of the way they look, they have all these millions of followers, and so companies then pay them to promote their clothing or whatever it might be. And so their whole living is based on their looks and these followers that they've built up. So we've built up this thing of being your own God, and that's one thing. The other one is the modern environmental movement. If you pay attention to the way those folks talk, and we've been told to be stewards of the world. We should be opposed to pollution and being, and want to promote, clean water and air and all of that. That's not even the issue. What ends up happening is when you pay attention to the environmentalists, that they're actually worshiping the earth and those things, and pretty much see humanity as evil. We're the problem, in other words. If we disappeared, everything would be fine. Well, that just flips on its head what God has created, in that he has given us dominion over this world. Where a modern environmentalist would say, oh, no, we're the problem. We shouldn't even exist. We do nothing but tear this thing down, and ultimately end up worshiping the planet and worshiping the animals and all of this stuff. And I'm sure there are other ones out there too if I thought about it longer, but those are the two that really come to mind. So we don't see a lot of, in North America anyway, a lot of people worshiping statues and dealing with witch doctors and that sort of thing. They still have that in other parts of the world. Arkansas too. There's witch doctors in Arkansas. I'm really not kidding. I'm not. I had a buddy that pastored, and I won't tell you where he was in Arkansas, but he had church members that would go to people that the only way to really define them is more like a witch doctor kind of thing. I'm sure it's everywhere, but he just happened to be in Arkansas. So those of you who are former Arkansans, I love to, nudge you every now and then. But anyway, that kind of stuff is still out there. But self and then the planet. Now, so if you've got, I don't want to get too political, but in far left, woke politics, whatever you want to say, abortion, they view it as like it's an act of worship. When you begin to realize that those who have rejected religion and have gone so far left and have gone so far woke and say they've rejected God, they've taken their leftism and their wokeism, and that is their religion. And so that's why you and I look at some of the evil things that they're involved in, and we just scratch our head and think, why is this even a thing? Why? But it's a sacrament to them. They might not understand that. They might not even know why they're responding like they are, but it's a religion. And that's how they respond. Well, so you have idolatry still out there, so we've got to make sure, because the Lord is jealous, and we can't put anything before Him. So then He quotes Adam some things that they've said. All things are lawful. That's a quote from the Corinthians. But then he responds, but not all things are helpful. Well, they say all things are lawful. Then he says, but not all things build up. In other words, yeah, there's freedom, but does that freedom put you in a position to do things that do not build up your faith? So he says in verse 24, and let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. This is where we start to get away, certainly from the idolatry of self. If you put others before you, then you are not going to make an idol out of yourself. So he gives some practical instructions here. And I don't know if this matters at Walmart and Kroger, but here you go. Verse 25. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. And what he means is don't ask the butcher, was this sacrifice to a god? Verse 26, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. He's quoting Psalm 24 here. So he's saying, if you go to the market and you buy the meat, just don't even ask about it and just buy it and know that it's the Lord's. Verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever's set before you without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. So you go to a lost person's house, they've invited you over, and that was a big thing back then, the idea of hospitality. We've kind of reversed that now, where we all hide in our homes and then come out occasionally. The idea of being hospitable really isn't so much a thing, anymore. It's just the nature of it. But back then, if you invited someone into your home and shared a meal with them, that was a big, big deal. If you'll remember in Acts, when Peter went into Cornelius' house, when he went into the Gentile house, he talks about, I'm surprised I'm even in here. I normally wouldn't even be in this place. I wouldn't have walked into your house, because he becomes unclean the minute he walks in there, and yet he goes in there and preaches the gospel. So Paul here is saying, if lost people invite you into their house, if you're a guest in their home and they put a ribeye in front of you, don't ask, well, was this sacrificed to Artemis? Don't do that. Just enjoy the ribeye like a good person should. Verse 28. But again, no, this verse, I just read 27. Verse 28. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? So here's what he says. You go to the lost person's home. That's the picture he's given. You're going to a pagan house. and they put the ribeye in front of you. Y'all tell I'm a little hungry. Yeah, and so I've talked about pizza and steak. I mean, that's like the two greatest things God ever created, I mean, as far as food goes. All the bagel bites are pretty good, too. I'm glad the Lord invented those. I've told y'all, one of my daughters to this day is mad at me. I owe her one bagel bite. Just in a moment of, I'm dad and I'm going to do that, I took the last bagel bite off of her plate and ate it because I wanted it, just to mess with her. I still owe her a bagel bite. She will never forget this, and I don't think I can make it up. It still comes up occasionally. So he's talking about if you go into a lost person's house, in their context, they put the food in front of you, and then, you don't ask, then they say, this meat was sacrificed to our God, whoever, Zeus, Hermes, Artemis, pick whoever that household worships. He says at that point, don't eat it. Now why? Well, remember, you're dealing with a lost person. You're dealing with someone who doesn't know Jesus. And it's more important for them to see you take a stand in a nice way for your faith and say, I can't have a part in this. It's more important for that to happen and them to see that than it is for you to accept that meal. Even though you know that whatever God it is that they sacrificed it to doesn't actually exist, but you also know at the same time there's demonic power behind that God. So you know all that stuff, right? The more you know, suddenly all this stuff starts to get complicated. But for their sake, so that you can later lead them to the Lord, so that you can later, they can come to you and say, why, what do you have that I don't? And how can I have what you have in your relationship with Jesus? You have lived this out in front of them. And this is one of those ways. So verse 30. If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? Paul's saying there's freedom. You could, in good conscience, in your own conscience, you could eat that meat, sacrificed to an idol, because you know the idol's not a thing. But for the sake of the pagan, don't do it, because it's more important for them than for you. So then he kind of gives the summary. So, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Now, that is an interesting thing to think about, that we are to eat and drink to the glory of God. In fact, anything we do, we're to do to the glory of God. So that tells me that anything we do, we can do to the glory of God. So if you're a bricklayer, you can be a bricklayer to the glory of God. If you're a school teacher, you can be a school teacher to the glory of God. If you are whatever, you just pick it, whatever your career is, whatever your career was, you can be that and do that for the glory of God. You can be a parent and a grandparent and a sibling and an aunt and an uncle and a neighbor. You can do it all for the glory of God, which means that we have to see these things from His perspective, which means we put others first. It means that we put His nature first, and who He is and how we say things and what we do. They have to line up with who He is, even though we in our flesh often don't want to do that. So, if you're in an argument over your property line with your neighbor, you conduct yourself in a godly way in that. And it means you don't let them run all over you. You use everything you're supposed to do. You make sure legally everything gets lined up like it ought to, because God has ordained government. But you do it in a way that you maintain your witness. So, you don't move the fence in the middle of the night. That kind of thing. You don't suddenly start taking pot shots at them with rock salt when they're getting in their car. I'm picturing Granny on the Beverly Hillbillies. You don't do that kind of stuff. It's a great show. Best show ever. One of our church members put on Facebook the other day, "What's the greatest show of all time?" I immediately responded with a gif of Granny. That's it, right there. Whatever it might be. Let's say somebody actually sues you. You and a neighbor, or, you get in a car accident or something, and suddenly you're in a legal battle. Well, you do what you're supposed to do. You do what the legal system, what God has provided, but you need to conduct yourself in a way that even those people who are suing you know there's something different about you. And so you've got to maintain that witness. Everything you do for the glory of God. So he says in verse 32, give no offense to Jews or the Greeks or to the church of God. So that's everybody. Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, and that's what he means, but that of many, that they may be saved. Because that's the ultimate issue, right? Well, what have we been commanded to do? Make disciples. Well, that means that lost people have to be saved. Well, a lot of that depends on, do we actually demonstrate that the gospel's made a difference in everything, in how we eat and what we drink and how we conduct ourselves at work and how we conduct ourselves within the family and how we act at the restaurant and how we act in line at Walmart and, whatever it might be. Are we actually living for the Lord? And so Paul throws it out there, and he's confident. He knows he's not perfect, but they know him. And he says, be imitators of me, because they know him. And he says, as I am of Christ. So as much as Paul emulates Christ, they are to emulate him. So as long as Paul is living for Jesus, Paul can then be their example. Because they've seen him. They've eyeballed him. None of us have seen Jesus, literally. We will one day. But how do you know? How do you know how a Christian is supposed to act? Well, the Bible tells you, but also, and this is like, kids learn by watching their parents much more than by listening to their parents. You and I have learned, and sometimes learned wrongly, what it means to be a believer because of how other believers around us act. So if you grew up in a house that constantly gossiped about church, then that's normal to you. It's sinful, but it's normal. If you grew up in a house, the old joke is, if you grew up in, that every Sunday lunch you had roast preacher, it was just, really critical of the pastor. I tell you who's really bad about this. This is not exactly the same, but it's close. Seminary students are the worst. We would when I was at Mid-America, we had chapel right before lunch. And so at lunch, because we all knew exactly how a preacher was what he was supposed to say and how he was supposed to say it, because we had been in seminary for 3 or 4 weeks, and just would criticize, and then we'd hear about something that happened at a church, and we're like, I can't believe they did that, when we didn't know anything about anything, It's real easy to have a critical spirit about those things. So whatever it is, that wherever you find yourself, other believers do influence us. This is why churches take on personalities. If a pastor stays at a church long enough, the church kind of takes his personality, because he's up here, and speaking more than anybody else. So if you have a very joyous pastor, you often have a very joyous church. If you have kind of a sour and down in the mouth pastor, sometimes that's the kind of church you get. So it just happens, over time. We tend to influence one another more than we think we do. And so that's what he's saying here. He lives in a way so that he won't hinder the gospel. So what's the point of all this? Well, the point really is verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, so that way he hadn't missed anything, do all to the glory of God. That's everything. There's no out. There's no part of life where that our Christianity doesn't dictate how we live. No part. And we forget that. We get in the routine of things. Whether it's, I'll give you an example. You're out in your yard. You're going to cut your grass, and your weed eater won't start. You're going to say something. What are you going to say? And how are you going to say it? I walked out of my house one time, and some neighbors were just, who are believers, were clearly aggravated with their lawn equipment. They were saying words I had forgotten. And I thought, ooh, this is not good. But sometimes in those moments, if we're not ready, if we're not looking for the way to escape, right? Because there's always an escape. That's what he told us in verse 13. So in a moment of anger, you can choose not to say the thing. in a moment of juicy gossip, you can choose not to engage in the conversation. The question is, we're all weak, so what happens when you don't do that? What happens when you do get involved in the thing? Well, you're going to get under conviction and repent of it. Ask God to forgive you and just move on. And don't do it again. That's how it works. And so everything we do, we can do for the glory of God. Some are harder than others, but that's what we can do. Well, guys, that is, chapter 10, 10:14 through 11:1. This is another one of those times where the first verse of the next chapter really should have been the last verse of the previous chapter, because when we get to verse 2 of 11, he begins to talk about, as I said, head coverings, and then he talks about the Lord's Supper, and then we're going to get into spiritual gifts in a few weeks and all of that, and the love chapter, and it's going to be interesting. We'll get to talking about tongues, and we'll deal with all that as we go through it. I don't know what I was thinking when I decided to teach through 1 Corinthians. Some of this stuff's hard, man. Just, do something easy like, a psalm or something. But this is where we are, and I'm enjoying it. So those of you who are watching online, thank you all for being here. If you have questions, send me an email, John, John, @mycbcc.org, and hopefully I can answer. But we're going to log off now and go to our prayer